Kevin Hunter and Jody Summers here on Health Kindness. Health and kindness all wrapped up into one great show. Well, we're going to talk about food addictions here today, and one of the little funny graphics that you shot up here, Jody. This showing tomato and ketchup.
Mhm.
I've had conversations with a lot of friends over the years that when I've mentioned to them that they should have more fruits and vegetables and things like that in their diet, they refer to these processed foods as saying that they have them. And one of the funniest ones was this gal who told
Mhm.
me, "Well, I have a blueberry Pop Tart in the
Right.
morning." So,
But it's funny, but there are it like people truly think that that could qualify.
right.
Qualifies a little bit. No, it doesn't qualify at all. Zero.
Hmm.
Nothing. Sorry.
Yes. If you could color something purple and then add corn
Right.
syrup, some people could be
Exactly.
fooled into believing that that's a blueberry
And
grape or whatever.
I don't think I don't think people think that it's a real fruit or a vegetable, but there's part of it that's okay. No, none of it is okay when it's not real, when it's food additives. And we're going to talk about how additives aren't really real and how they're addictive. So,
Hmm. So let's explain a little bit of this process here with stages of food processing and how it
yeah.
actually destroys the good food quality.
So, for years we talked about food as like real whole nutrient dense food and processed food.
Hmm.
But in studying a lot about processed food and food addiction recently in the last few months, I just really want to talk about this topic because there are really more than one type of processed food. So there's there's real nutrient dense food, which is just as it is. Now, of course, you're going to cook meat and you can cook vegetables yourself.
Hmm.
That's not what we're talking about. But in the processed food world, if you go to the grocery store, there really are two kinds of processed food. So, like what you see here, there's tomatoes, but then there's things added. Now, I can still would still consider on the screen there the tomato, ketchup or whatever that is to be a super processed because it has sugar in it. But I'm talking about things like that. Let's say would be beef jerky, which is just dried meat. It's still a real food. It's just preserved.
Hmm.
What would be another like a dried nut, a roasted nut?
Hmm.
Again, it's processed, but it keeps the integrity of the food. When we move into the what we think of as processed food, which is kind of the ultra processed, which is like chips and sodas and cakes and packaged foods and candy and anything that falls under those addictive type foods that people crave, those are ultra processed foods. And those are what make up the majority of the SAD American diet, the standard American diet, which is the calories and all of the bad fats and, high sugars and high fructose corn syrup and, sodium that's off the charts and all of those things. So those are the ones that I really wanted to talk about today and how um, food companies through the years have worked on adding in additives that are actually addictive. And so
Hmm.
one of the things that we are completely, we know a lot about addiction in our country, like alcohol addiction and gambling and even now spending addiction, and we've heard a little bit about computer addiction. One that I think is not talked about, and I have actually seen it been denied by scientists because I think people don't want to even accept it, is the
Hmm.
addiction to processed foods.
Hmm.
We have a whole industry on, even in mainstream medical, when we're talking about like stomach reduction surgery, so like the sleeve and gastric bypass and all of we have a whole industry on people who are addicted to processed foods who now need to have surgery because they can't stop putting food in their mouth. And I'm not blaming people 100% because the food companies have done their very best to make those foods addictive. We have
Hmm.
triggers in our brain, um, just like when we do drugs or smoking or whatever that is, that spur on these really good feelings. And people who are addicted to the um, additives in the food get that same craving, that same feeling of relaxation. If people who are food addicted will know this, and I will say, I almost sent you a picture years ago. I had been significantly heavier many years ago, and I remember, like, when this is when my kids were really little, my life was very, very stressful, and I remember the feeling that I would get when I wasn't careful what I was eating. And I would get that, like, once the kids were in bed, I'd finally sit down with a bowl of ice cream. That was my number one choice every night. And
Mm-hmm.
how I would feel so relaxed, and it was that relaxation food. And it wasn't necessarily because the kids were in bed, it was because I was eating a processed food and I had a processed food addiction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think anybody who's been addicted to those foods knows that feeling of that good feeling of, what's the word I'm looking for? Um, it's just
Yeah,
a
you almost like you
relaxation.
release these positive endorphins and all that other kind of
Endorphins.
stuff. Yeah.
That's the word I was looking for. Yeah, exactly. And it happens with food just like it happens with smoking. And I mean, I've never been a smoker, but from my understanding, you get that release, um, just like people who are gambling, you get that energy and then you get that release. It's the same
Mm-hmm.
exact thing.
Mm-hmm.
So my degree is in dietetics and food science. And when I was in college, I was actually at the very end, when you do your internship, I had actually was pregnant with my first daughter. And so I was the only student who was allowed to do my internship actually on campus at the college. Everyone else had to go into different companies or whatever. So I actually interned with one of the professors, the food scientist professor there on the campus. And he was doing some kind of a study, and I don't know whatever happened to it. I wish I would have followed up, but I just didn't. Where my job, specifically as an intern on that college campus, was to monitor people's responses to food additives. And I
Right.
think he was doing some kind of a study for a food company or something. And so people would bring in, like, everything was done on paper then, nothing on computer. So people would bring in these filled out forms, and I would compile them together for him. And I would see, did they like it? Did they like this product? Whatever. It was all additives. None of it was about food. And so even back then, they were trying to find out through this food additive program, I guess, that which of these additives did people have the best response to, so they could put them in this manufactured food product.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it is truly a planned program from big food industry to put these in so people like their product and become addicted to it. And this is an addiction that was celebrated in the United States. It's not like some of the others that are, I don't know, I won't say looked down upon, but, like, people are smoking. Oh yeah, when are you going to give up smoking? How often do you ever hear, when are you going to give up processed food addiction? it
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
it
It
just
doesn't
doesn't happen.
happen. There's the interesting thing you pointed out, the standard American diet, and I've said this
Mhm.
before on this show, that the standard American diet leads to the standard American diseases, and so it's sad in more ways than one. Interesting point you shared with us here offline. 18 of the most addictive foods. That's followed up by 17 of the least addictive foods, and I want to share this a little bit for our viewing audience because things like pizza, chips, cookies, ice cream, French fries, cheeseburgers, soda, cake, fried chicken, rolls, all these kinds of popcorn, all these kinds of foods, like the worst things, but are in everybody's weekly diet. These are all on this top 18 least addictive. Now, when I roll down to the 17 least addictive, these are actually foods that show up on our dinner table regularly, thanks to
Mhm.
my wonderful wife, Stephanie. Things like cucumbers, carrots, beans, apples, broccoli, banana, salmon. So when you like listen to all of those, that second list, you go, wow, those are just foods, aren't they?
They're
Yes.
just food. Yeah. you
Here's
know
the
um,
interesting thing that I have, and I thought this was probably more related to ketosis, is an eating more of a keto kind of diet. But now as you talk about these addictions, I think it actually goes back to we have so significantly departed from that addictive food lifestyle that I actually never have a point in my day where I would say that I'm starving. We only eat because we know that feeding the body is a good thing to do. But we have our noon to 1 o'clock time frame that we have a meal, and we have our evening meal, and I never experienced this. I'm just starving, or I never experienced this. Man, I could really go for, and then your mind locks in on this kind of food, and that's, food addiction does that. And I think about, somebody even addicted to cocaine or whatever, and obviously that's a very specific addiction, and their craving specifically is for that kind of drug. But when you're eating, food off of this 18 most addictive food list. Yes, your brain is going to zero in on a specific kind of food. And when you mentioned that, I'm not surprised at all that the additives are designed around creating a addiction. Food makers and restaurateurs and all these other people, they also know that the olfactory sense of smell also hits these triggers. And that's why when you go into like a grocery store, you get bombarded with those smells as soon as you walk in, or a restaurant will pipe those out of their hoods and out into the street, and somebody's all, "Where's that garlic bread? Where's that garlic bread?" And so go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, when you're talking about triggers, one of the ways, the thing about addiction, the first thing is to acknowledge that it exists. And again, I've heard people in the medical industry say, "Oh yeah, that doesn't exist. There's no people, some people overeat, but nobody's addicted to food." And I'm like, have you ever watched the 600-pound life? I mean, people are addicted to food. Have you ever been on an airplane where it's a 3-hour flight and people have to bring their own processed food on the plane because they can't go 3 hours without eating a snack bar or a bag of chips or cookies or whatever? I mean, people are addicted to processed food.
They can't watch their favorite movie without doing that.
So one of the keys to kind of overcoming, I did make a really quick list of ways to kind of overcome this addiction, like any other. And this is not my specialty, addiction, but is to acknowledge that it exists, to acknowledge, yes, I have a problem here, and then decide to quit. And I know, you have shows about keto, and we've talked many times about nutrient-dense food, and just switching over even at a slow baby pace is steps in the right direction. Making a plan and being prepared, writing out that grocery list and writing out those things that you need to get at the grocery store, and making those on the weekend for the rest of the week. So when you come home, you're hungry, that there's, an egg dish in the refrigerator, or there's something that is nutrient dense that will fill that gap, that you don't have to stop for fast food. To identify the triggers, and that's what made me think of this list, is, if you walk out of exercise class, but there's an Italian restaurant next door and you can smell the bread, maybe go out the other door and go around. So you're not triggered, identify which triggers. If you love the fast food restaurant on the way home from work, drive a different way so you don't see it and want to pull in. Avoiding those triggers are really important to making it easier. I mean, it doesn't make it go away, but makes it easier. And then the last one would be a truly, introduce a nutrient-dense food program in a shorter eating window, so you don't have those spikes in blood sugar causing those cravings. But to acknowledge that people are addicted to processed foods, and nobody's addicted to a cucumber. It's just, or a chicken breast. I mean, it just doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's right. This is a different sense altogether. But when you talk about being addicted to highly processed foods, there are some foods that are on this on the fruit and vegetable side that I wouldn't call myself an addict of, but there are times I'm like, man, I could really go for that. So you take something like fresh ginger as an example. It is so satisfying to the digestive system that there will be time, like we went to a rare time, we went to a restaurant, it was just yesterday evening for dinner. I'm sitting there in the restaurant looking around me, and I'm going, I recognize why we don't want to come here that often, because I don't know if I saw a single healthy person in there. that was the sad truth. And then we're leaving from there, and I'm like, Steph, I need some ginger kombucha. Like, I, I gotta have something.
I
This
get
this
it.
food we had there, and we tried to order like the best stuff, and even got the salad buffet where we could, select
Right.
our foods off of the buffet there. But even then, I found myself going, man, I really need some ginger in my gut, and that helps significantly. I want to mention one other thing because you touched on keto briefly, and we do a show here on Wednesdays, Keto
Mhm.
Kitchen. And one of the things that we tell our viewers all the time, if you're a keto fanatic, you're probably going to miss the mark when it comes to health. And the reason being is that health is, as you just said, nutrient dense foods. Health is not about focusing on one nutrient or like a macronutrient like fat. Yeah, you want your fats higher in your diet, but our diet is kind of a combination of keto and paleo, and then we've really taken to heart like the conversations you've had in the past about the difference between good quality carbs versus poor quality carbs. Somebody would say, I don't want a teaspoon of sugar in your diet, and I agree totally. But if you wanted to eliminate carbs entirely, then you're going to miss things like strawberries and blueberries and carrots and all that other kind of stuff that you should not be taking out of your diet. So,
At
yeah,
least not permanently. If you want to do it for a short time, that's fabulous.
sure.
But not on a long-term basis. There's nutrients in those foods that you cannot get. Living enzymes are really important. They
Hmm.
provide energy. They raise the vibration. They raise the enzymatic workings of the body. And the only place that you can get those is fruits and vegetables that aren't cooked. They're raw. And so there's even a place, I deal, like I said in the past, I see independent clients, and I do a lot with people who have cancer. And one of the things, I won't say all the time because it's not all the time, everybody's different, but even sometimes I'll recommend juicing, which is completely opposite from the ketogenic diet. But people sometimes, especially if they have cancer, have damaged digestive systems. And the only way to get those living enzymes in them is through taking out the fiber and just getting the juice of the celery or the carrots or the greens, that they're unable to eat. And so there's a time and a place for all of these things, but nutrient
Sure.
density never leaves that. You can have nutrient dense vegetarian diet.
Hmm.
Um, so that's the number one part for health.
Hmm.
So,
One last category I want to mention really quickly on these highly preserved foods and the difference between good nutrients and or good quality nutrients and poor quality nutrients. One of the common fads in the so-called health and fitness industry are these protein shakes and all these different shakes that people like to drink. And you look at what these containers are, and they're just jam-packed full of all of these bad ingredients
yep.
we just talked about. And so don't think you're doing yourself a great favor by buying one of these canned shakes. If you're not looking at that ingredients list, you're probably
Yep.
contributing to the food addiction that you have. So, all right. Well, Jody, great information as always. And I hope people here learned something about food addictions. And if you got one, own up to it and start getting those nutrient dense foods back into your diet. And you'll notice that those crazy food cravings will go away. Kevin Hunter with Jody Summers here on Health Kindness. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.